Today we're in Proverbs 31, verses 1 through 9, and we've come to the seventh and final collection of Proverbs. This collection is from a man named King Lemuel, and just like Augur, we really do not know who this was. He was apparently a wise king, most likely not an Israelite, but who had some knowledge of God, and God uses him as a mouthpiece to share his wisdom in the Proverbs. And it's actually wisdom that he received from his mother. And the overall counsel in these first 9 verses is do not sacrifice your purpose on the altar of pleasure. Lemuel is a king, and he has a very specific purpose in leading his kingdom in righteousness and wisdom. He has so many responsibilities to the people under his care that he has to stay laser focused on his purpose and not allow himself to be distracted by the pleasures of this world. Otherwise, all of the people counting on him will suffer. And she speaks so tenderly to him in verse 2, calling him her son. And when she says, "O son of my womb," she's recalling the day that he was born and their history together from birth to raising him to the point where he finally became king. And then when she calls him, "O son of my vows," she's recalling the time even before she got pregnant, when she was already thinking about him and making vows to God, probably like Hannah did with Samuel, making vows to God that if you give me this child, I will do such and such for you. So first and foremost, she roots and grounds Lemuel's purpose in the Lord because he was a blessing to her, given to her by God as a result of her vows. And she says in verse 3, "Do not give your strength to women or your ways to that which destroys kings." Oftentimes, kings in the ancient world would have harems, and they could go indulge themselves in sexual pleasure anytime they wanted. But she knows a life given over to pleasure can drain a king of his mental clarity, of his wisdom, and of his strength. In other words, if he's up all night partying, he's going to wake up in the morning completely exhausted with no physical energy left to run his kingdom and no spiritual energy either, because his conscience will be plagued by a lifestyle he knows is displeasing to God and distracting him from his God-given purpose. Now, I don't think she's telling him not to ever have sex with his wife. No, she's telling him not to worship sexual pleasure or to let that be the driving force in his life. And the same thing is true about alcohol in verses 4 and 5. I don't think she's telling him never to have a single drop of alcohol, but rather to not let alcohol destroy his purpose through drunkenness and intoxication, because a king who does not have his wits about him cannot make good decisions based on the laws of the land. And while the afflicted are having their rights trampled, the king won't be in his right mind to do anything to stop it. No, she says drunkenness is not for kings. It's for people who are on their deathbed in verse 6 and whose life is bitter. And in verse 7, it's for poor people trying to forget their pain and their troubles. Now, it's important to know in verse 6, she's not literally telling him to go and give alcohol to people who are dying and who have bitter lives. That would be completely counter to what she wants him to do, which is to help the needy and the afflicted and those with difficult lives. She's just describing the kind of people who typically spend their time getting drunk. Those people are trying to drown their sorrows. But a king should never be drunk because he has a God-given purpose. Back in verse 5, to make sure to uphold the law that has been decreed in the land and to protect the rights of the afflicted. And now in verse 8, to open his mouth for the mute, for those who have no voice because they're too poor to afford one and they're vulnerable to being taken advantage of. Instead of the poor and the afflicted needing to get drunk to drown their sorrows, they should instead have a king that looks out for their best interest and helps them so that they don't have to turn to the bottle for help. But if the king gives himself over to the pleasure of models and bottles too, he's not going to be any help to the people who need him most. He will be offering up his purpose as a sacrifice in worship to the God of pleasure. And so the challenge for us is to realize one of the major problems with sin is that it distracts us from our purpose and calling by God. We may not think of ourselves as kings or queens, but the New Testament says as Christians friends, that's exactly what we are. In 1 Peter 2 and verse 9, it says, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood." So we're not just priests, we are royal and regal priests. And of course, that's only possible because we've attached ourselves by faith to Jesus, the King of Kings. So in Romans 5 and verse 17, it says, "We reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ." We often think of Jesus being raised up and exalted to be seated at the right hand of the throne of God. But in Ephesians 2 and verse 6, it says that God raised us up with Jesus and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ. So we are co-rulers with Jesus, which means we have an incredibly high calling to reflect his royalty and rulership in this world, which is why Paul says in Ephesians 4 and verse 1 to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called. In other words, make sure your life does not distract you from your purpose. And of course, that means not sacrificing our purpose on the altar of pleasure. There are so many pleasurable things in this world that are perfectly fine to enjoy, like sex with our spouse, or delicious food, or beautiful sunsets. But Satan loves to turn good things into ultimate things. And if Satan can turn pleasure into something that we worship and that dominates our life, he can pull us away from our purpose. So that means staying away from drunkenness, staying away from sexual excess, scrolling social media, or watching TV and movies for hours and hours and hours while the people in our lives are suffering because they need us. No, as one writer put it, royal calling requires righteous restraint. We're called to restrain the excesses of pleasure so that we can embrace our purpose. And this points to Christ, the ultimate King that these 9 verses point to. Jesus' purpose was to seek and to save the lost and to help needy, afflicted souls like us. And he refused to allow pleasure to distract him from his purpose. Satan tried to get him to do that. It started in the wilderness when Jesus was suffering from hunger, and Satan told him, "Look, if you're the Son of God, just turn these stones into bread," which I think goes beyond the temptation of just that moment. I don't think Satan's point is just to say, you should satisfy your hunger right now because you need food. I think he's tempting Jesus to use his power and position as king to live for his own pleasure. Because it's not just that Jesus could turn a stone into bread. If he wanted to, at any time during his ministry, he could turn stones into jewels and gold and be the richest man on earth and build the most beautiful palace the world had ever seen. As the Son of God, Jesus' glory could have surpassed that of Solomon's glory, and he could have had a massive harem of women, all-you-can-eat buffets all day long, in a life so pleasurable that it would surpass man's wildest dreams. And yet Jesus, though he drank wine at meals, never got drunk. And though there were many women around him as disciples and followers in the crowd, he was never sexual with any of them. In fact, he was so focused on his purpose, he never even got married because he knew even though that would be an innocent pleasure, even that would distract him from his purpose. And he refused to sacrifice his purpose on the altar of pleasure. Instead, he sacrificed himself on the altar of worship to the one true God, and thus fulfilled his purpose, giving his life to defend the afflicted and needy. So as we call on God for wisdom today, our prayer is, Father, help me realize my life is not a game. Your calling and purpose for me are so serious and important. And there are people in my life depending on me to take care of them and to teach them about Jesus and to help them in their affliction. May I never be distracted from my purpose by the domination of pleasure. And may I never sacrifice my purpose, but rather make it my purpose to sacrifice myself the way Jesus did for me.